You're listening to Level Up Game Product Managers Edition with Melissa Zeloof from ironSource and Joe Kim, the founder of Game Makers.
Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to Level Up, the podcast for people who love making, growing, and of course, playing games. This week's episode is the second installment in our new mini-series focused on game product management. And the subject is how user acquisition and product management teams at games work together and the advantages that can bring. We're joined by my wonderful co-host for this mini-series, Joe Kim, who's the founder of the Game Makers blog and YouTube channel, and by Nebo from N3twork and Jon from Smule, who are both running UA at their respective companies. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being on the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Thank you for having us.
I thought we could just first start by having Nebo and Jon. If you guys could first talk about your backgrounds and kind of what you're working on now.
Yeah, sure. I'll start. By the way, I like how when they introduce me, they usually say Nebo from N3twork. It sounds like N3twork is my band. And it is in a way.
I have to admit something. I meant to ask you before we started how to pronounce your last name, and I forgot. So I was like, right, I'm not going to screw it up. I'm just going to go with Nebo from N3twork because it sounds punchy. And so does Jon from Smule. So I was like, I think this can work. But yes, how do you pronounce your last name?
I usually say Radovic. It's Radovic, actually.
That's what I thought. Okay, well.
Yeah, but it's funny, though, because before I was Nebo from N3twork, I was Nebo from Machine Zone. That sounded like a band as well. So yeah, okay, I'll start. I'll tell more about myself. I'm Nebo. I run UA at N3twork. N3twork is a mobile game developer based in San Francisco. We're best known for the game, legendary Game of Heroes. Recently, we announced a partnership with Tetris. Before that, I worked at Machine Zone that I mentioned, and Nordeus, which is another successful game developer from Europe.
Cool. I guess I'll go next. So my name is Jon Lau. I am the director of UA at Smule. And if you don't know, Smule is a 11-year-old, very music-oriented app company based in San Francisco. You probably know of our legacy app, Sing Karaoke, which has recently been rebranded as Smule. Like many people within the UA industry, I actually started my professional career in banking. And one day I decided banking was too boring. Reached out to a friend of mine by the name of Adam Ben David and joined a company called Supersonic, which is eventually acquired or merged with ironSource. And from there, it really kind of springboarded me from the supply side to demand side and into UA, and I've never looked back.
Great. And just as a reference for people in the audience, we actually discussed this topic in terms of the collaboration and integration of user acquisition and product management teams. First with you, Nebo, as a video interview on my Game Makers YouTube channel, and then with you, Jon, during a UA roundtable event we co-hosted together in LA. But for me, it's really exciting to have both of you here together discussing this topic because, I actually think that both of you are kind of in the forefront in terms of thinking about this issue today. And so when we think about the past 1 to 2 years, it seems like there's been an increasing strategic competitive advantage deriving from having, the user acquisition and product management teams work more collaboratively together. But I thought we could first start by talking about why do we want this? And maybe starting with you, Nebo, what kinds of advantages and how much of an advantage does working together give mobile game teams?
Yeah, sure. So I think the major change that happened in the industry is that more and more games rely on monetization using LevelUp services, where their games are monetized using weekly or daily events. And as a result of that, monetization is much more complex and relies on events, on a lot of different experiences in the game versus just having one sort of linear experience where monetization is pretty much the same for every single user. As a result of that, we had to change the way we approach user acquisition because so much depends on the events. We had to track how monetization changes when we implement different things in the game. And what really this allowed us to do is to be more aggressive on the spend side and understand better how and where we can spend money to grow the game. If you're a small company such as N3twork, we're around 100 people. This is really crucial for, maintaining your cash flow and making sure that, you grow as aggressively as possible while maintaining your payback windows and making sure the company is financially healthy.
And Nebo, just to get a little bit more specific in terms of what the two teams are collaborating with together, would it be things like coming up with ROAS yield targets, planning UA spend. Could you be a little bit more specific in terms of some of the specific things that are being worked on together?
Yeah, of course. So it's pretty much all of the above. So in the beginning of the month, we define RI targets together. When you work with PMs, and I believe that's something we'll talk about later as well, it's important to kind of find the common language with the PMs and, define targets that are easy to understand for both teams. So if it's RI for the UA team, it should be like a D7 or whatever, DX RPI for the game team. And then we figure out what the budget is for that month, what the CPI targets and MPU or paying conversion targets are for the month. And then based on that, we try to estimate what the revenue for the month is going to be and what is the number of paying users, the highest number of paying users going to be in the game. So once we have that plan, we make sure that we bring as many players in the game and payers in the game that month to hit the target. And the game team makes sure that those users are monetized well so we can hit the revenue target together.
And then, John, I know one of the applications that you talked about was more on the Fatui and user experience side. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So specifically when I was at Play Studios, we had a portfolio of mobile slot games. One of the things that we identified as somewhat broken was that slot innately is a very niche product. And a lot of the people that we are acquiring through user acquisition channels are existing mobile slot users, whether it is existing mobile slot users from our existing portfolio or potentially other slot games. So I guess this flagship game at the time, My Vegas, the Fatui experience was really teaching someone how to play slots. It's, to me, that's akin to, teaching, the World Series of Poker champion how to play poker for the first time. It didn't make a lot of sense. So we started to take a step back along with the designer, along with the product manager to really re-examine how that flow should work and taking a look at who we are acquiring from user acquisition channels. So for example, if we're running a value-based lookalike on our payers and acquiring them on Facebook, we could safely assume that some of these users are existing slot payers or players. They're likely paid sometime in their lifetime. So should we then give them the same Fatui experience that teaches them how to play slots? If not, how can we redesign that experience that accentuates the value proposition of My Vegas at the time without making them feel like we're taking them back to kindergarten? And I think that was a very interesting kind of test that we ran that gave us some really deep insights as to how we could redesign not just the Fatui, but also the rest of the user lifecycle.
Nebo, you talked about how as monetization became more complex, it led to UA teams and PM teams kind of working more closely together when you talked about LiveOps. How does ad monetization kind of fit into this? Does it create a different kind of collaboration, or is it kind of more of the same? Yes, we need to work more closely together to make sure that everything's working optimally.
Yeah, so ad monetization in our case is handled by the UA team, and Legendary as a game is not big on the ad monetization side of things. So I might not be the best person to say that, but I play a lot of idle clickers and idle games, and based on how frequently placements change and all the things that I see happening in those games, I'm pretty sure the PM teams even there work closely with UA to make sure that RPI is high, that they can buy aggressively against those targets. But again, I'm not the best person to provide this answer.
I guess I can add a little feedback there. At Play Studios and now at Smule, when I first started in both companies, ad monetization was looked upon as kind of like this kind of filthy thing that no one really wants to do.
Necessary evil.
It's like necessary evil, right? And oftentimes it's really just like plug it in and forget about it. So it wasn't really truly incorporated into the gameplay or the game flow in a way that truly maximizes the efficiency of ad monetization. So using Play Studios as an example, when I first joined, having come from the network side and really was selling kind of ad monetization, I was early advocate of really bringing in multiple networks and I think we actually ended up having ironSource being the supply side platform which we were actually serving these ads. But there was this fundamental philosophical difference between what the executives felt was acceptable versus monetarily what we were actually providing from the ad revenue front. So we could generate a lot of revenue, but at the core, the CEO or the executives might feel like, oh, this is not really on brand, or are we potentially cannibalizing our users? What we've seen in the last couple of years, not just at Play Studios, but also in the industry, is the acceptance of ad monetization as a revenue channel, right? So we don't look at it as something different. Rather, it's another tool within our tool set in which we could effectively monetize our users. It's no different from IAPs, no different from developing a new feature. And what's interesting is that both at Smule and at Play Studios, they fully started to adopt this idea and have someone in-house that's truly working on this full time. I know my previous boss and mentor, Rich Shu, is actively looking for someone to do this at Play Studios, simply because of the fact that the executives are now on board, right? They see what companies like Zynga is doing and how much ad revenue they're generating. And they understand, look, fundamentally, we can do something different and something that's palatable to everybody and make it a worthwhile experience. So I thought that was a very interesting shift in the industry.
I wanted to provide two more examples. One is Adventure Capitalist, and the other one is Idle Miner Tycoon. So if you guys play these games, you probably notice how they run events as well. It's part of their job is just to figure out how to serve more ads. And events are a great way to do that. So it's really, really interesting to see how, even simpler games such as Idle Clickers are doing live ops like operations to basically increase the ad revenue. And as a result of that, to increase RPI. I think just the things that they have in their toolbox are different, but the end goal is the same, to increase the LTV and to make sure that you can scale the game as aggressively as possible.
So not to sort of hijack the topic of the podcast, but in a way, the same way that UA and PM teams are working together, the same, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that ad monetization as a concept or as a philosophy, or I guess, as you put it, John, a philosophical approach, is becoming thought of more in terms of a product than a layer that's kind of put on top of an existing game. John, when you were talking about your mentor looking for someone to sort of do this, he's looking for a product person or an ad monetization person, or both in one?
Yeah, in principle, I think he's looking for someone who can go in there and really do ad monetization full time. My understanding of this role is someone who's going to be working very closely with product, right? Part of it is basic like waterfall management and fill management of ad monetization, but really working with the product teams to design placement, to A/B test how to best surface an ad without interrupting the user's game experience. And I think that's really part of me is kind of maybe jealous of it, because I spent 3 years advocating for pushing more ad monetization at Play Studios, and without much success. Of course, the moment I left, it became this thing that everyone wanted to do. But a part of me feels like I'm actually happy because it's somewhat of a legacy that I'm.
It's like being the eldest child, right? It's always tougher for the eldest child. They have to sort of break. I mean, if anyone can't tell, I'm an eldest child, but yes, that makes sense. Talking more sort of zooming out and looking at the industry, how many game companies or studios do you guys think are actively kind of working in the terms we've described, sort of collaborating more between UA and PM teams? Nebo, take that first, maybe, and then John.
I think the number one reason, or one of the things that helps us do this, is that we're still fairly small. With bigger companies where UA and PM teams are siloed, it's much, much harder to do so. But I'm pretty sure that all the companies are our size, which are between 50 and 100 people, that monetize games with live ops efforts do some sort of collaboration at this level. But I'm not sure whether it's at the same level as we do, simply because since the very beginning of since the very time when I joined N3twork, we've been doing this and working together with PM teams. So I'm not familiar of other companies doing that at the same scale.
To my understanding, having been on the sales side and working with a lot of different UA teams in the industry, I would say about 4 years ago, you already saw the introduction of integrated UA teams within product. However, I felt like at the time, most of the UA teams that were embedded within product were simply there to serve a function. So they were simply there to acquire users, and that's it. And there wasn't any additional collaboration into how to design the flow better or something like that. I think to Nebo's point, it really depends on the size of the company, right? So if you're talking about a startup or let's say anything that's below 50 people, you're kind of forced in a position where everyone have to wear more than one hat. So you could be UA, but you probably have a pretty deep understanding of how product works and work very closely and collaborate with the product owners to develop something, that's optimal for the company. But what I've seen in the last year or so is that I'm seeing a revisit of integrated UA teams within product, and I'm starting to see more of this collaboration across many different companies of various sizes. So I think the industry as a whole is understanding that, hey, as what Nebo said, monetization strategies become more complex, more customized. You really need collaborative effort to provide unified messaging, whether that's in CRM, in UA, and retargeting. It's very necessary for all these different stakeholders to work together.
And what do you think are some of we've established that it's probably a good idea, often necessary. What are some of the reasons why it doesn't happen? Are they sort of purely operational? Nebo, you sort of mentioned if teams are traditionally siloed, then it's very difficult to bring them together. If they were sort of like merged from the start, then it works well. Is it operational, or is it more sort of character driven or ownership driven? Is there any reluctance between teams to work together?
There's definitely some reluctance, simply because we're all busy with our like day-to-day operations, and the easiest thing to do is just say, hey, I'm in charge of UA. I don't care what's happening in the game. You guys figure it out. I'm 100% sure the users I bring in the game are high quality. It's your fault, and you just that's pretty much where you stop caring about the outcome of your company. The other problem, which is like probably more common than just not caring enough, is the fact that it's really hard to align these two teams. It took us quite some time to figure out the common language. It takes a while to teach everyone on the team how we hit certain ROI goals, and why acquiring users on Facebook is different than acquiring users on offer walls or a rewarded video, because it's simply different. And then there are things we can do together to make the company more successful, right? So it took us a while to figure out the common language, and just to, maybe game teams don't understand ROI, but they understand ARPI really well, and what are the ARPI targets they need to hit. And then once you figure out what's the best way to communicate with PM teams, then, that relationship starts growing, and eventually, people start understanding more complex UA concepts, and people on the UA team start understanding better more complex PM concepts, which is probably the state we're at right now. The data science guys or some of the more experienced PM guys on the legendary team understand really well, what UA team does and what are the channels we're buying from and what are the specifics of the channels, which I find quite unique. And that's something we've been working on for 2 years. But to provide a short answer, it's not simple. It requires us to focus on one common goal and then to work together to get to it, to define a common language, and then to make sure we build that relationship or grow that relationship over time.
Yeah, and from my experience, it seems like a lot of the, based on these challenges and based upon not having the realization of the benefits of having UA and PM teams work together, as having been in publishing for the past 4 years and, having visited many studios, it does seem like, most UA and PM teams are working in isolation. And part of the reason that we're talking with both Jon and Nebo is that they seem to be on the forefront in terms of this type of co-working. But Jon, I remember a couple of years back, you had mentioned to me when you were at Play Studios about trying to have these two teams actually sit together. And I was wondering if you could actually talk more specifically in terms of, as far as a cross-team process, how should that be designed and optimized?
Two pieces to that I can think of. So first is like the idea of being closer to one another. And I think the best example I can think of is actually there's two. So for example, at Play Studios, the Konami team in Austin and the Pop team in Tel Aviv, they don't look at each function as an individual. They don't look at each, let's say, oh, you're UA, you're CRM, you're engineering. They don't look at each other as, okay, you're your own respective team. They look at the product as one team. So for example, using Konami, the live ops manager is seated next to the person who's managing the UA, who's seated next to the product manager and the engineers, so that there's a clear understanding of the business needs and the business requirements. Very much to what Nebo said earlier about understanding, hey, what are the product goals this month? And from that, each respective team will design collaboratively how their different functions can serve to kind of hit that goal. And I remember seeing that in the Austin team and see how they work together. And that was actually very, very successful in the way that they can deliver the messages or to deliver the experience that they want to the user. Pop is another great example where that cross-team kind of management or optimization was really great, where there's a deep understanding of the business needs, not just on the UA side, on the product side, but even on the engineering side, right? Because oftentimes when I personally work with an engineer, they see things in a very specific structure. One example I can give is like when one instance in-app messages broke within one of the apps. And the engineer was like, well, what's the big deal? We could just do a hot fix on the next release. And we had to explain to them, well, from a CRM perspective, it's a big effing deal, right? Like you often lost one of the biggest tool for us to really go out there and retouch the user and deliver the messages that we want, both on the live ops side, could impact revenue. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, the director at CRM had to really explain that to a senior engineer within the game was really confounding to me. But I came to realize, well, that's because they're, from personality standpoint, from the way that they were trained, they were not taught to think in those terms. So breaking that barrier of helping each other understand what are the common languages and vice versa, right? Because the first time I heard the term agile or scrum, or I'm like, what are you talking about? What's this magical thing you're talking about? And over time, you understand, okay, this is how an engineer thinks. This is how BI thinks. Allowed us to find that universal language that Nebo mentioned so that we can think of how to optimize the process between teams. Oftentimes in UA, we talk about how we could optimize our buy, or be more efficient with how we spend our dollars. Well, part of that is optimizing the process between the different functions within a company, right? If I submit a Jira ticket and it takes engineers 3 months to get to it, that is not optimal. So how can I help BI understand what my business needs are and how that impacts the company or the product overall so that they can prioritize? Because oftentimes they're looking at it from a prioritization perspective. They have 100 different things that are broken. So what makes it UA any different from any other function? So building that relationship, both personally, but also functionally, is important for us to be able to kind of excel at a faster pace. I hope that answers your question.
Got it. And then Nebo, for you at N3twork, could you also talk about how you've kind of designed and optimized your cross-team processes? In particular, maybe if you can be specific in terms of whether it's goals or communication or meetings or things like that, and like how is that designed at N3twork?
Yeah, so to add to what John mentioned and basically answer your question, I think it all starts from senior management and should be in charge of defining the common goals for the product team as a whole, including the UA team or the product, really, not just the product team. And when you have one goal that works for all teams, which is if we hit this number this month, then we're successful, right? And then what happens with that is that there's no pointing fingers when people have the same goal. It's not like, hey, you guys, you're not doing your job well. The users you brought us to the game are simply not good. Why are you doing this? We cannot hit our goals because you guys cannot do your job well. And vice versa. Like the UA team cannot, blame the game team for not being able to monetize users well enough if they have the same goal and they work together on hitting that goal. So there's more transparency, and as a result of that, people are more focused on action than blaming each other, which happens quite often in big companies. So how does this work? It's in our case, we have daily meetings where we just go over the high-level metrics, try to understand, have there been any changes in the game that could potentially impact UA, both from like a positive or a negative way. We just go over the ROI numbers and what happened in the last few days, and then we look into the event performance because we run weekly events. We've been running the events for like 180 weeks now, which is quite impressive. And we're just like trying to understand, what's the impact of the current event on the payback windows and on the monetization of the game as a whole. And then we try to understand what are the things we can do next week to improve the performance, whether it's more engagement campaigns, if we have like a new fresh piece of content that's really cool and people want to see, or something we can do on the UA side to promote new characters, or to like buy more from certain channels if we improved onboarding. So we have these discussions. They don't necessarily have to be long discussions, maybe like a few minutes, where we just update each other on the latest and greatest in UA and PM, and basically everybody moves to their own respective teams and continues working on whatever they're working on. But key here is to have like a process and to be transparent with each other and just make sure that everybody understands what's going on each side, whether there are any significant game changes or UA changes that could change the way the game monetizes.
Hey, Nebo, quick question. When you guys are developing the goals like internally, do you guys separate between, let's say, new cohort revenue that UA can bring in, or the percentage of new cohort revenue that UAs bring in versus like the older cohort revenue that from existing users? Do you guys differentiate between these two when you guys are determining the goals so that you guys can actually measure or project the potential impact of how much money UA can actually bring in on a monthly basis versus what's coming from existing users?
Yeah, definitely. So that's automated at this point in N3twork. It's part of the platform suite of products. And what happens is basically once we define targets, let's say we're going to spend $2 million this month, average CPI is going to be $10 or random number, $5. Average payer conversion rate is going to be 3%. I'm just like giving you random numbers. And then we figure out, okay, if we hit these numbers, this is how much money same month's cohort is going to contribute. Let's say it's going to be 15%. So we're going to make $300K out of the same month's cohort, August cohort in this case, and all the other revenues coming from older cohorts. But because we understand the LTV curve really well, we can basically automate that process, and we just need to input what the UA spend for the month is, and the script or the Cavendish product, as we call it, is just going to provide us an answer on what the monthly revenue target is.
So Nebo, thanks for your response. I just wanted to actually highlight for our audience the point that you made about user acquisition and product management teams actually having an aligned goal. And just wanted to highlight just how important that is, because in practice, as you pointed out, a lot of user acquisition teams and product management teams can come at odds and have this kind of blame game happen where they become more adversaries rather than partners working together. And in many cases, having that collaboration and common goal could be very critical to the success of a game. So I just wanted to highlight that point.
I have a question about timing, I guess. Do you guys find that collaboration is more important or becomes more critical at different stages of kind of a game life cycle? Is soft launch kind of a very heated time of collaboration and it sort of tails off and then sort of recharges around specific events, let's say? Or, I mean, you've both sort of described systematizing, or I guess creating processes around bringing these two teams together. But do you find that there are sort of certain times in a game's life cycle where you are working more closely together because it's simply unavoidable?
I can go first. I think realistically and ideally is from the dawn of a game, these teams are working closely together, because a lot of times right now what we're going through, or at least what I'm going through, is I'm trying to build this process into an existing process, right? So you have what's existing is that these teams don't talk to one another, or they don't collaborate together as closely as they should. And it's very hard because you have to break a lot of habits. You have to break a lot of existing processes in order to implement new ones. So ideally, if you are creating a new game and from the get-go, you guys are already building these functions in where the cross-team collaboration happens, to me, that would be the best case scenario.
For us, we pretty much start from the very, very beginning. It's basically even when you're just in your ideation phase, thinking about what the new games should look like teams could already start working with the UA team to test, the look of the game, the basic idea, basically to test the early MVP of the game, just so we could understand as early as possible whether that particular game or product has a chance to become a hit or not. And then the more mature the product is, the relationship intensifies, because it's there's very little you can do in the soft launch phase. I mean, you can test obviously and drive a few hundred or a few thousand installs a day, but the real fun part starts when the game is launched worldwide, when you operate in 200 countries and there are so many different kind of levers that you pull. That's when you can get the most out of this relationship. In the very beginning, in the soft launch phase, I think that's where we get back to the old UA PM kind of relationship, where it's just hey, what's going on? How many installs can we drive today? And what's the retention? But you really need scale scale and a complex monetization system to get the most out of this setup.
And do you think we're going to see this happen with more teams more widely in the game industry, sort of not just UA or monetization? I mean, I guess at a certain point you kind of run out of teams, but do you think we're going to see more merging and kind of breaking down of silos, or are there sort of limited places where this kind of collaboration works?
It's a good question. I mean, there's definitely an opportunity to improve like the way, our teams work with UA and data science, but there's a point where that's not really efficient. It's like, okay, should all teams work with all other teams? I'm pretty sure if you study organizational management, whatever, different management schools, that somebody tried that at some point, just wanting to create super flexible teams. But at some point, like you reach a point of diminishing returns, and that's not really smart. With UA and PM teams, you're like directly working on a very specific thing, which is make the product make more money, or directly contributing. And that's a very important goal for the company. And as a result, it makes a lot of sense for those teams to work together. But, UA team, you could argue that makes the same sense to work with a CS team or QA team. But I guess that the benefits of those two teams working together are not as high as the benefits that we get from working with the PM team.
Right. And not higher than the costs of trying to make them work together.
Yeah. I mean, we should look at everything through like an ROI lens in the company. And in certain cases, like the ROI is simply not there, to use the UA lingo.
Mm-hmm.
No, I 100% agree with what Nebo is saying. I think, what I'm seeing now is user acquisition teams are starting to better understand how product lifecycle works, how to build or design a marketing strategy around what product is doing, and vice versa, having product understand what are the levers that UA can actually pull, right? It's not just go, oh, there's a magic button called scale and volume that we could just press. And try. If only, right? But beyond just product, I think going back to what I was saying earlier about cross-team process management, it's really working closely with like BI or analytics. Of course, if you guys don't have an embedded member or at least a dedicated member, for us at Smule, we have centralized BI engineering, we have centralized analytics, so we oftentimes have to go to them for support for various items. So having that collaboration, building that relationship or those bridges so that they can prioritize your tasks, similar to how product can potentially prioritize UA needs when they're thinking about product design, can be very, very helpful. The parts where I don't think would be helpful, again, to Nebo's point, is working with CS or QA, where I think it's nice to have some visibility, but it's not ultimately going to be a game changer when we're talking about essentially growing revenue or building the company into a higher milestone.
One last question from me, guys. In terms of areas of competitive advantage, what do you guys think are the other big areas user acquisition or product management teams should be looking at? It seems like there are some kind of popular areas that are being discussed, whether it's creatives optimization, machine learning based bid and budget optimization, sales and merchandising. Is there anything I'm missing, or what are you guys thinking about?
I have two main thoughts here. One is basically not just machine learning based bid and budget optimization, but also customizing experience in the game using the attribution data and UA data. So potentially a Facebook user should have a different onboarding experience and monetization experience than a user who comes from like an incentivized channel. I think John mentioned earlier today that players who play slot games already know how to play slot games. So there's no need to teach them how to play slot games. So I think the customization and kind of more granular approach in tailoring experience is going to happen on both sides, on both the UA and PM side, because we simply can't do that right now because attribution data is pretty much real time. And the second thought that I have that I've been thinking a lot is how scalable this really is. Can you do this with 10, 20 different games? And why big companies don't implement the same approach? And I think one of the challenges for us and for the whole industry is how to standardize these processes or create systems and tools that are going to help us scale this to more than just one game. That's something where also machine learning could play an important role, and it's definitely something we're going to work on.
I agree with that. I think, going back to the early example, most UA teams don't only manage new user acquisition, but oftentimes retargeting and bringing lapsed users back into the app. And I think a true competitive advantage is for UA to really study the user lifecycle and understand, what are the pushers and pullers that is leading a user to come or go. So using retargeting as an example, do we truly know why someone churned, for what reason, right? Slots, for example, did someone leave because they were bored of the content, or did someone hit a losing streak and lost all their funds and they rage quit? Now, these are fundamentally two very different reasons why people are leaving. So should we then design a different way of reaching them back out to them, right? To understand what is the value prop of us trying to get that user to come back. And when they come back, what type of experience will we give them, right? Are we just going to plop them back to exactly where they were when they left? Or are we going to design something like a returning user experience for these people? Nebo had a great point about scalability. It's very hard to scale once you slice and dice something so fine and so thinly. It's going to be a challenge to understand, okay, how can we group these individuals into manageable segments so that we can scale this? And I think that's where machine learning will definitely play a part. And interestingly enough, that's actually something we're looking at.
So guys, that was super interesting. Thank you, Jon from Smule and Nebo from N3twork, for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
It's been very interesting, and thanks everyone for listening. Tune in next episode for more game product managers talking all things GPM related here on Level Up.